Hi guys, welcome to Talk to Rachel and welcome to Rachel's Book Club. Hoje vamos ter o restante do segundo caso do Sherlock Holmes. Para quem está chegando agora, a gente estamos estudando esse livro, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, e você pode acompanhar todos os detalhes dentro do meu grupo de Telegram e lá no meu canal de YouTube, ok? Estamos no segundo caso do Sherlock Holmes, ok? Na última aula, no último vídeo, vemos sobre a morte, suspeita de morte de Mr. Oldacre. E hoje a gente vai continuar e ver como Sherlock Holmes vai descobrir o que aconteceu naquela noite. Vamos lá! Lestrade stayed in the room with us after Macfarlane left. Holmes picked up the lawyer's papers and looked at them. Then he passed them to Lestrade. "These are very interesting, aren't they?" he said. Lestrade looked at the papers for a minute, then said, "I can understand the first few lines perfectly. The writing is good. After that, the writing is very bad, and I can't read it. Later, there are some more good lines. Then the writing is bad again." "Why do you think it's like that?" asked Holmes. Why do you think it's like that?" asked Lestrade. "The answer is very simple," said Holmes. "Mr. Oldacre wrote this on the train on his way to London. The good parts were written at stations. The bad parts were written when the train was moving." Lestrade laughed and said, "Very good, Mr. Holmes, but how does that help us with the case?" "Well," said Holmes, "most people don't write their wills on trains. It seems that this will wasn't really very important to Mr. Oldacre." "It was very important," said Mr. Lestrade. "His will is the reason that he's dead now." "Do you think that's true?" asked Holmes. "Don't you?" replied Lestrade. "It's possible, but the case isn't very clear to me yet." "Not clear," said Lestrade. "It's very clear to me. When Macfarlane knew about Mr. Oldacre's will, he went to Norwood, he killed Mr. Oldacre, and then he burned the dead body. It seems very simple to me." "Too simple," said Holmes. "Macfarlane is not stupid. A clever man doesn't kill a man on the same day that he made his will. And the man's servant knew that Mr. Macfarlane was in the house. Does a clever man carefully burn the body and then carelessly leave his stick in the house?" "You know very well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "that a murderer doesn't always think very clearly just after his crime. It's easy to forget something like a stick. Perhaps he was afraid to go back into the house. What other motive is there for Mr. Oldacre's murder?" "I can think of many possible motives," said Holmes. "Here's an example. A thief was passing the house and saw the two men in a room with the papers. He thought that they had money there. When one of them left, the thief came in through the window, then he killed the other man." "Why didn't he take anything?" asked Lestrade. "Because he found only papers. There was no money in the room," said Holmes. Lestrade did not seem very sure of his ideas now, but he said, "Well, you can look for your thief if you want to, Mr. Holmes, but I think Mr. Macfarlane was Mr. Oldacre's killer. He had a motive. He was the only person in the world who did not need to take anything from Mr. Oldacre's house. It was already his, in Mr. Oldacre's will." "I didn't say that you were wrong," replied Sherlock Holmes. "I only wanted to show you that there were other possible motives for Mr. Oldacre's death. And now goodbye, Mr. Lestrade. I will probably see you at Norwood later today." Lestrade left us, and Holmes put on his coat. "I'm going to Blackheath," he said. "Well, why not Norwood?" I asked. "Two strange things have happened, my friend, and the police are only thinking about one of them. The first thing was the strange will. Why did Oldacre want to give his money to Mr. Macfarlane? I'm going to find out." "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked. "No, it isn't necessary. You can't help me. There's no danger at Blackheath," replied Holmes. It was quite late when my friend returned from Blackheath. He was not happy. "I'm afraid that the case is difficult, Watson," he said. "This time I think that perhaps Lestrade is right. I still don't think that Macfarlane killed Oldacre, but the facts are helpful to Lestrade and they don't help me. I'm afraid that he'll win." Did you go to Blackheath? I asked. Yes, I did, said Holmes, and I quickly discovered that Oldacre was a very unpleasant man. I spoke to Mr. Macfarlane's mother. She was very angry and afraid. Oldacre wanted to marry her many years ago. She agreed, but later she changed her mind. She heard that he was unkind to his animals. This made Oldacre angry. On the day of her marriage to Mr. Macfarlane, he destroyed her photograph and sent the pieces to her with a letter full of hate. If the police discover this, they'll think badly of young Mr. Macfarlane. He clearly had another possible motive for killing Oldacre. After meeting Mrs. Macfarlane, Holmes then went to Norwood. He showed me the simple plan of Oldacre's house and the garden which he made there. The garden was large, and the fire was a long way from the nearest road. Lestrade was not there when Holmes arrived, but another policeman showed him everything. They found some pieces of Oldacre's clothes where the fire was, continued Holmes, and some burnt parts of an animal or a person. I looked at everything very carefully, but I found nothing new. There's very little blood inside, and there are only 2 men's footprints on the floor. I looked at the papers on the table. Some of them were in packets, closed with red wax. Mr. Oldacre's bank book was there too. I was surprised to see the amount of money in it. He had less money in the bank than people believed. It was not enough to make Macfarlane rich. Then I spoke to the old woman, Oldacre's servant. I think she knows something, but she told me very little. She let Mr. Macfarlane into the house at about 9:30 and soon went to bed. She didn't wake up until people started shouting about the fire. She thinks that the burned pieces of cloth come from Mr. Oldacre's clothes that night. That's what she told me. But I'm sure that she's hiding something. I can feel it. Next, Holmes told me a strange thing. Oldacre was paying money to Mr. Cornelius. This was the reason why he had very little money in the bank. Nobody knew who Cornelius was. Holmes then became very serious. I'm afraid that Lestrade will be able to hang Mr. Macfarlane for murder, and I don't know how to stop him. I went to bed soon after this, but I do not think that Holmes slept at all. When I got up next morning, Sherlock Holmes was reading the morning newspapers. There was a letter from Lestrade on the table. It said, "Come to Norwood soon. I have discovered a new fact. I am sure now that Mr. Macfarlane killed Oldacre. Lestrade." Lestrade is clearly very pleased that he's right. He thinks that I'm wrong for the first time, said Holmes. I must go to Norwood. Please, Watson, will you come with me? I need a friend today. We drove together to Oldacre's house. Lestrade was waiting for us there. Hello, Mr. Holmes, he cried. Have you found your thief yet? I haven't found anything yet, replied Holmes. Well, I have, said Lestrade. You do seem very pleased with yourself, Holmes answered. Lestrade laughed loudly. Sherlock Holmes doesn't like being wrong, does he, Dr. Watson? He said to me. I did not reply, and he continued. Please, come this way. He took us into the house. Macfarlane came this way after he killed Oldacre, he said. Now look at this. He pointed to a mark on the wall. It was a thumbprint, and it was the colour of blood. That's John Hector Macfarlane's thumbprint, said Lestrade. It's exactly the same as the print which Macfarlane made in prison this morning. He showed us a piece of paper with Macfarlane's thumbprint on it. That's the end of the case, said Lestrade proudly. Yes, it is, I agreed. Yes, it is, said Holmes in a strange voice. I looked at him and was surprised. He seemed very happy. Lestrade continued to talk proudly, but Holmes was quietly laughing at him. Very good, said Holmes. This is a lesson to us all. Yes, it is, the detective replied. Who discovered this thumbprint? Mr. Oldacre's servant, the old woman. She found it this morning, said Lestrade. Are you sure that the mark was there yesterday? Said Holmes. Lestrade thought that my friend was mad. I did not understand what his question meant either. Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade, how do you think that Macfarlane got out of prison? And if he did get out, why did he come here? Then Holmes said, well, it's his thumbprint. We can be sure of that. Yes, we can, said Lestrade. And now I must go. I'm a busy man and I must write my report on this case. We went quickly into the sitting room and closed the door. "Why were you so pleased about the thumbprint?" I asked Holmes. "Because I know that it wasn't there yesterday." I looked at that wall very carefully. The police didn't look as carefully as I did. That's why they're not the best detectives. "Now, Watson, let's go for a walk in the garden." I followed Holmes. I couldn't understand how the thumbprint got there, and I could see that Holmes did not want to tell me yet. He looked at every part of the outside of the house. Then we went back inside and he looked carefully in every room. We looked in every cupboard and walked down every passage. We were in the last passage at the top of the house when Holmes suddenly started laughing. "This is an interesting case, Watson," he said. "Lestrade thinks that he's better than me. He had fun when we were talking about the thumbprint downstairs, but I think that I can have some fun now. What shall I do?" "I know." We went down to the sitting room where Lestrade was working. "Are you writing your report, Mr. Lestrade?" asked Holmes. "Of course I am," the detective replied. "Isn't it too early for a report?" Holmes asked. Lestrade put down his pen and looked at him. He knew Holmes well. He could see that he had important news. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, there's one important person in this case that you haven't spoken to," said Holmes. "Really? Who? Can you show me this person?" said Lestrade. "Yes, I think I can," said Holmes, "but I shall need some help. How many policemen are there here?" "3, said Lestrade. "Are they strong men with loud voices?" asked Holmes. "Yes, they are, but how can their voices help us?" "You'll soon find out," said Holmes. "Now please ask one policeman to bring a few old newspapers. There are some in the kitchen. The other 2 must bring plenty of water." The police brought the things, and all 6 of us went up to the top of the house. The policeman was smiling. Lestrade still thought that Holmes was mad. I did not know what my friend wanted to do. Sherlock Holmes walked to the end of the passage and carefully put the newspapers on the floor. Then he said, "Watson, please open the window and then start a fire here." I did what he asked. The papers soon started to burn. Next, Holmes said, "Now I want you all to shout fire with me. Shout as loud as you can. 1, 2, 3, fire!" We all shouted. "Again!" cried Holmes. "Fire!" "Again! Fire!" we shouted as loudly as possible. Suddenly the wall at the end of the passage opened like a door. An ugly little man ran out like a rabbit coming out of its hole. "Very good," said Holmes. "Watson, put some water on the fire, please." Then he said, "This is Mr. Jonas Oldacre." "Where have you been for the last 2 days?" said Lestrade in a strange voice. Oldacre laughed, but he was clearly afraid of Lestrade. "I haven't hurt anyone," he said. "You haven't hurt anyone?" repeated Lestrade angrily. "Because of you, Mr. John Hector Macfarlane is in prison. We thought he killed you. He was almost hanged by the neck for murder." "I only did it for a joke," said Oldacre. "You aren't going to play any more jokes now," said Lestrade. He told the policeman to take Oldacre away. When they left, Lestrade said, "I must thank you, Mr. Holmes. I was rude to you earlier, and I'm sorry. I really thought that the case was finished. Mr. Macfarlane mustn't die for a crime that he didn't do." "Don't worry," said Holmes kindly. "No one will know what happened. You can change your report. It isn't necessary to say that I helped." "But don't you want people to know about your skills?" asked Lestrade. "No," said Holmes. "I'm happy with my work, and that's enough for me. Now let's see where that rabbit was living." The end of the passage was closed to make a small room. Inside it there was a little furniture. On the table there was some food and water and some newspapers. When the door was shut, it was impossible to see the room behind it. Oldacre was a builder. He was easily able to make this place for himself, said Holmes. He only needed his servant's help with his plan. "How did you know that he was here?" asked Lestrade. "I thought that he was hiding somewhere in the house," Holmes replied. "I saw that this passage was shorter than the one below it. Then I realized where he was." "That was clever," said Lestrade. "But why do you think that he was in the house?" "The thumbprint," said Holmes. "It wasn't there yesterday when I looked, so somebody put it there last night." "But Macfarlane was in prison. How was it done?" When Oldacre and Macfarlane were working on the papers, they used a lot of red wax. They used it to close the packets, said Holmes. Oldacre asked Macfarlane to do that job because he wanted a clear thumbprint in the soft wax. Later, Oldacre used the same wax to put Macfarlane's print on the wall. He probably used blood from his own thumb. Wonderful, said Lestrade, wonderful. But why did he do all these things, Mr. Holmes? I wanted to laugh. This proud detective was asking questions like a child with his teacher. That doesn't seem difficult, said Sherlock Holmes. Oldacre hated Macfarlane's mother. A long time ago she refused to marry him. You didn't know that, Lestrade, because you never visited Blackheath. Oldacre is a very unpleasant and dangerous man. He waited many years to make Mrs. Macfarlane unhappy. Then at last he thought of a way to plan her son's death. The law hangs her son for murder, and at the same time he makes some money for himself. Makes some money? How? Asked Lestrade. His papers show that Oldacre had money problems, said Holmes. He wanted to disappear without paying his bills. He paid a lot of money to a Mr. Cornelius, but I don't think that Mr. Cornelius exists. Oldacre planned to change his name to Cornelius after he disappeared. The will gave Mr. Macfarlane a motive for murder, and the fire explained why there was no dead body. It was a clever plan. Mr. Cornelius could come alive in another part of England after Mr. Oldacre died in Norwood. But now, Mr. Lestrade, let's go and ask him some more questions. We went down to the room where the policemen were keeping Jonas Oldacre. When he saw us, he said again, I only did it for a joke. I didn't want to hurt dear Mr. Macfarlane. I don't think that anyone will believe that, said Lestrade. I think you'll have to go to prison, Mr. Oldacre. And I think that the police will take all Mr. Cornelius's money too, Holmes added. Oldacre looked at Holmes and said in a very angry voice, I'll kill you, Sherlock Holmes. Holmes smiled and said, You're not the first person who has said that to me, but you'll be too busy in prison for the next few years. Before you go, I have a question for you. You burned something like a dead body with the wood. What was it? Was it a dead dog or perhaps some rabbits? Oldacre sat in angry silence. Holmes laughed and he said, He doesn't want to tell us, Watson. Well, it isn't important. If you ever write the story of the Norwood builder, put rabbits. Então, esse foi a última parte do segundo caso do Sherlock Holmes. Eu espero que você gostou desse segundo caso. Se você tem uma pergunta sobre o vocabulário, verifica o glossário que está lá no meu grupo de Telegram e também acompanha com transcrição para você também aproveitar e aprender mais sobre o vocabulário, especificamente phrasal verbs, etc. I'll see you then. Take care, guys.